I'm standing at my father's graveside in the pouring rain, mascara running down my cheeks, when my brother Derek leans over and whispers with a smirk that makes my blood run cold. "Just so you know, Vanessa, Dad changed his will 3 weeks before he died. You get absolutely nothing. Not a single penny." The lawyer hasn't even finished the eulogy, and already my older brother is twisting the knife. I'm Jennifer Hartwell, 32 years old, and I'm about to discover that the father I spent the last 6 months caring for during his battle with pancreatic cancer had apparently decided I wasn't worth remembering in his final wishes. But what Derek doesn't know, what none of them know, is that lawyers keep records. And sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it needs to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I learned early that being the younger daughter in the Hartwell family meant existing in the shadows. My father, Richard Hartwell, built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up, starting with a single strip mall in 1983 and expanding into shopping centers across the Pacific Northwest. By the time I was born in 1993, the family business was worth millions, and my brother Derek, 5 years my senior, had already been anointed as the heir apparent. My mother, Patricia, died when I was only 7 years old. Breast cancer took her quickly, leaving Dad to raise 2 kids while running a demanding business. I still remember the night she passed, how Dad sat Derek and me down in the living room of our Laurelhurst home and explained that Mommy had gone to heaven. Derek, 12 at the time, nodded solemnly like he understood the gravity of adulthood being thrust upon him. I just cried and asked when she was coming back. After Mom died, the dynamic in our house shifted dramatically. Dad threw himself into work with an intensity that left little room for parenting. He hired a succession of nannies to manage our daily needs, but emotional support was scarce. Derek seemed to instinctively understand what was expected of him. He became Dad's shadow, spending weekends at job sites, asking questions about property values and tenant agreements, absorbing everything about the business like a sponge. I tried to follow the same path at first. I remember being 10 years old, asking Dad if I could come to work with him like Derek did. He patted my head absently and said, "Sweetheart, the construction sites aren't safe for little girls. Why don't you stay home and play with your dolls?" When I protested that I didn't want to play with dolls, that I wanted to learn about buildings like Derek, Dad just laughed and said I'd understand when I was older. The pattern continued throughout my childhood. Derek got to attend property inspections and lease signings. I got dropped off at piano lessons and art classes. Derek was invited to business dinners where Dad introduced him to investors and contractors. I ate meals with whatever nanny was currently employed, usually in the kitchen while Derek and Dad discussed market trends in the dining room. School became my refuge and my rebellion. If I couldn't earn Dad's attention through the business, I'd earn it through achievement. I threw myself into academics with fierce determination, making honor roll every semester, winning science fairs, excelling in debate club. My freshman year of high school, I won a statewide essay competition on urban development and sustainable architecture. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd written passionately about the very industry Dad refused to let me participate in. When I brought home the award, a crystal plaque and a $500 scholarship, Dad was in his study reviewing contracts. I knocked on the door, excited to show him what I'd accomplished. He glanced up from his paperwork, looked at the plaque for maybe 3 seconds, and said, "That's very nice, Jennifer. Put it on the shelf with your other trophies." Then he went back to his contracts without another word. The shelf he referenced was in the hallway outside my bedroom, lined with debate trophies, academic medals, and certificates of achievement. None of them had ever warranted more than a cursory acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Derek's participation trophy from a recreational basketball league sat prominently on the mantel in Dad's study, displayed like it was an Olympic gold medal. High school was when the comparisons became most painful. Derek had been an average student, graduating with a 3.1 GPA and no particular distinctions. But Dad praised him constantly for being practical and business-minded, traits that apparently mattered more than academic excellence. When Derek announced he was skipping college to work full-time at Hartwell Properties, Dad threw him a celebration dinner at Portland's finest steakhouse, toasting his sons, real-world education, and natural business instincts. 2 years later, when I graduated as valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA and acceptance letters from Stanford, Berkeley, and MIT, Dad's response was decidedly muted. He came to my graduation, arrived late, and left immediately after the ceremony for a property closing that apparently couldn't be rescheduled. There was no celebration dinner, no proud toasts. Just a check for $2,000 with a note that said, "Congratulations on your achievement. Use this for college expenses." I chose to attend University of Washington in Seattle, close enough to visit home but far enough to build my own identity. I majored in architecture and urban planning, still harboring some hope that if I gained expertise in real estate development from an academic angle, Dad might finally see my value. I interned at prestigious firms during summers, working on mixed-use developments and commercial projects that directly related to Hartwell Properties' portfolio. Every time I came home for holidays, I'd try to engage Dad in conversations about my internships, about innovative building techniques I was learning, about market trends I'd studied in my commercial real estate courses. He'd listen politely for maybe a minute before changing the subject to whatever project Derek was currently managing. My brother, with no formal education and learning everything through trial and error, was apparently more qualified to discuss business than I was with my degree and internships. The contrast in how Dad treated us became even more stark as we entered our 20s. When Derek turned 25, Dad gave him a 30% stake in Hartwell Properties and made him vice president of operations. The gift was worth roughly $4 million at the time, plus a generous salary and bonuses tied to company performance. Derek marked the occasion by buying a ridiculous sports car and a penthouse condo in the Pearl District. When I turned 25, I received a Tiffany bracelet and a card that said, "Happy birthday to my little girl." The bracelet was beautiful but impersonal, clearly selected by Dad's secretary rather than by Dad himself. I wore it exactly once, to a family dinner where Derek spent 2 hours detailing his latest acquisition of a shopping center in Beaverton while Dad hung on every word. When I tried to mention my thesis on sustainable urban development, which was being published in an academic journal, Dad interrupted to ask if I wanted dessert. After graduating with honors and a master's degree in urban planning, I was hired by Chen and Associates, one of Seattle's top architectural firms. I worked on major commercial developments, affordable housing projects, and urban renewal initiatives. My designs won awards. My name appeared in industry publications. I was building a successful career entirely independent of my father's empire, proving I didn't need Hartwell Properties to succeed. But a small, stubborn part of me still hoped Dad would eventually notice, would eventually acknowledge that his daughter had value beyond being his little girl. That hope kept me showing up to family dinners, kept me calling once a week, kept me trying to bridge the gap that had existed since childhood. I met Thomas Chin, my firm's senior partner's nephew, at a company holiday party when I was 28. He was a structural engineer with his own successful practice, intelligent and ambitious but also kind in ways I hadn't experienced from the men in my family. We bonded over our shared passion for innovative building design and our complicated relationships with family legacy. His family had expectations too, different from mine but equally suffocating. Thomas proposed after 18 months of dating, and I said yes without hesitation. Planning the wedding revealed the family dynamics in sharp relief. Thomas's parents, despite being reserved by nature, threw themselves into the preparations. His mother spent hours helping me select flowers and table settings. His father, a retired engineer, insisted on reviewing the structural integrity of the venue, which made us all laugh but showed how much he cared. My father showed up to exactly 2 wedding planning events, the venue selection, where he mostly checked his phone, and the final tasting, where he brought Derek along and they discussed a potential property acquisition for the entire meal. Dad's contribution to the wedding was financial, a generous check that covered a significant portion of expenses. But when I asked if he'd like to help choose the music for the father-daughter dance, he delegated the decision to his secretary. The wedding itself was beautiful, held at a historic estate overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. Thomas's family filled their side of the venue with relatives who'd flown in from across the country. My side was notably sparse, just Dad, Derek with his latest girlfriend, a few cousins I rarely saw, and my Aunt Susan, Mom's sister, who'd maintained contact with me despite Dad's general disinterest in his late wife's family. During the father-daughter dance, Dad seemed distracted, going through the motions without really being present. As we swayed to a song Mom had loved, I tried one more time to connect with him. Mom would have loved this, don't you think? I asked softly. He nodded vaguely, already looking over my shoulder toward the exit. She would have been very proud of you, he said, the words automatic and hollow. Then, almost immediately, I have an early morning meeting tomorrow, so Derek and I will be leaving right after dinner. They left before the cake cutting. Thomas squeezed my hand as we watched them go, his quiet support meaning more than any words could. His parents stayed until the very end, helping us gather gifts and laughing with our friends. That night, in our hotel room, I finally accepted what I'd known deep down for years. My father was never going to see me the way I needed him to. I could earn 12 degrees, win 100 awards, and it would never be enough because in his eyes, I would always be less than Derek. Thomas and I bought a craftsman house in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood and threw ourselves into our careers. I made junior partner at Chen & Associates by age 30, the youngest person in the firm's history to achieve that position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas's engineering firm was growing rapidly, taking on increasingly complex projects. We talked about starting a family eventually but decided to focus on our professional goals first. My relationship with Dad remained cordial but distant. We spoke every few weeks, superficial conversations about weather and work that never went deeper than surface pleasantries. I stopped trying to impress him or earn his approval, which paradoxically seemed to make our interactions easier. When I stopped pushing for validation, the disappointment hurt less. Derek, meanwhile, had fully embraced his role as Dad's successor. He made increasingly bold acquisitions, some successful and others questionable. Dad backed every decision unconditionally, covering losses when Derek's gambles didn't pay off and celebrating wins as proof of his son's brilliance. By Derek's early 30s, he'd married Claudia, a former model he'd met at a charity gala, and they had 2 children, Aiden and Brooke. Dad doted on his grandchildren in ways he'd never doted on me, buying extravagant gifts and attending every school event and soccer game. When I hinted to Dad about Thomas and I thinking about starting a family, his response was lukewarm. That's a big decision, he said carefully. Make sure it doesn't interfere with your career. You've worked hard to build something independent. The message was clear. Derek's children were extensions of the Hartwell legacy, worthy of Dad's time and attention. Any children I might have would be Chen's, not Hartwell's, and therefore less important. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing blueprints for a mixed-use development when my cell rang with Dad's number. We weren't due for our bi-weekly call for another 4 days, so I answered with a hint of concern. Dad? Everything okay? His voice sounded older than I remembered, tired in a way that immediately alarmed me. Jennifer, I need to tell you something. I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors are saying I have maybe 6 months, possibly less. The blueprints slipped from my hands. What? When did you find out? Last week. I've been having symptoms for a while but kept putting off seeing a doctor. By the time I went in, it had already spread. He paused, and I heard something crack in his usually controlled voice. I wanted to tell you before Derek did. He knows already. He's been helping me get my affairs in order. Of course Derek knew first. Of course Dad had already been making plans with Derek. But none of that mattered in the face of this devastating news. What's the treatment plan? Are you doing chemo? Surgery? The oncologist says surgery isn't an option at this stage. We'll try chemotherapy to buy some time, but we need to be realistic about the outcome. Another pause. I'm going to need help, Jennifer. Derek has the business to run, and Claudia has her hands full with the kids. I was hoping you might consider coming back to Portland for a while. The request caught me off guard. After 32 years of being treated as an afterthought, Dad was asking me to put my life on hold to care for him. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was another example of me being valued only for utility, only when needed. But the daughter in me, the little girl who'd spent her whole life seeking her father's love, couldn't say no. Of course, Dad. I'll talk to Thomas and my firm. We'll figure something out. Thomas supported the decision immediately, understanding what I needed even if I couldn't fully articulate it myself. My firm granted me a 6-month leave of absence, my projects redistributed among other partners. Within 2 weeks, I'd moved temporarily into Dad's Laurelhurst house, the same house I'd grown up in, now feeling both familiar and strange. The first month was an adjustment. Dad had hired a part-time nurse, but I handled most of the daily care. Preparing meals that his failing appetite could tolerate, managing medications, driving him to doctor appointments and chemotherapy sessions. Derek stopped by occasionally, usually to discuss business matters with Dad or to drop off paperwork that needed signing. He rarely stayed long and never helped with the actual caregiving. Claudia came by even less frequently, usually with the kids for brief visits that exhausted Dad more than they cheered him. She'd sit in the living room, scrolling through her phone while Aiden and Brooke ran around the house. She never offered to help with meals or medications, treating the house like a hotel lobby rather than a home where someone was dying. As the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. Dad and I started actually talking, having real conversations for the first time in decades. Late nights when he couldn't sleep, we'd sit in his study, and he'd tell me stories about building his business, about Mom before she got sick, about mistakes he'd made and regrets he carried. One evening, about 3 months into my stay, he looked at me with unusual clarity. "I haven't been a good father to you, have I, Jennifer?" The question hung in the air between us. I could have deflected, made it easier for both of us. Instead, I chose honesty. "No, Dad. You haven't. You've treated Derek like your heir and me like an inconvenience. I spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, and nothing I did was ever good enough." He nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. "I know. I knew even while I was doing it, but I didn't know how to change. After your mother died, I couldn't bear to look at you sometimes because you looked so much like her. Derek looked like me, so it was easier. And then the pattern just set in, and I didn't know how to break it. You could have tried," I said quietly. "You could have shown up. To my graduations, my award ceremonies, my wedding. You could have asked about my life instead of always steering conversations back to Derek." "You're right. I absolutely could have. I was selfish and cowardly, and I used Derek as an excuse to avoid dealing with my grief over Patricia." He reached for my hand, his grip weak from the chemo. "These past few months with you here, this is the closest I've felt to having a real relationship with you. I'm sorry it took me dying to finally pay attention." The apology felt genuine, and despite all the hurt, I found myself squeezing his hand back. "I'm glad we're having this time together now, even if the circumstances are awful." Over the next several weeks, our conversations continued. Dad shared regrets and reflections, showed vulnerability I'd never witnessed before. He told me he was proud of what I'd built independent of him, that my strength and resilience reminded him of Mom. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, actually listening to my answers. For the first time in my life, I felt like my father truly saw me. Then Derek announced at a Sunday dinner that he'd closed the biggest deal in Hartwell Properties history, acquiring a portfolio of medical office buildings worth over $50 million. Dad's face lit up with pride, and just like that, the focus shifted entirely back to Derek. The rest of the evening was spent discussing the acquisition, Derek's strategic vision, and how this would position the company for generational growth. I helped clear dishes while they talked, feeling the familiar sting of being sidelined. When I returned to the dining room, Dad was signing documents Derek had brought, amendments to the company operating agreement to reflect the new properties. I caught a glimpse of other papers in Derek's folder, including what looked like estate planning documents, but thought little of it at the time. Dad's health declined rapidly after that dinner. The chemotherapy was causing severe side effects, and his oncologist finally recommended stopping treatment to focus on comfort care. Hospice nurses began coming daily, and I converted the downstairs guest room into a proper medical space with a hospital bed and equipment. Dad was sleeping 18 hours a day now, and when he was awake, he was often confused or in pain that even the morphine couldn't completely eliminate. Derek's visits became even less frequent during this final stage. He claimed the business needed his constant attention, that Dad would understand his absence because someone had to keep the empire running. Claudia stopped coming entirely, saying the kids shouldn't see their grandfather in such a deteriorated state. I found myself alone with Dad most days, just me and the rotating hospice nurses, watching a once powerful man fade away. 3 weeks before Dad died, he had one of his increasingly rare lucid moments. I was sitting beside his bed reading a novel when he suddenly spoke clearly. "Jennifer, I need to talk to you about something important. About my will and the business." I set down my book, surprised he had the energy for serious conversation. "Okay, Dad. What about it?" "Everything is set up to be fair. I've made sure of it. The house, the investment accounts, the business. You and Derek will both be taken care of." He struggled to sit up slightly, and I adjusted his pillows. "I know I favored him for too long, but I've tried to balance things now. When the time comes, you'll see." Something about his phrasing felt odd, but he drifted back to sleep before I could ask for clarification. I assumed he meant he'd updated his will to divide assets more equitably between Derek and me, perhaps giving me a stake in Hartwell Properties or ensuring I inherited some of the valuable real estate holdings. The conversation gave me an unexpected sense of peace. Maybe Dad's deathbed reflection had led to genuine change. 2 days later, Derek arrived with his lawyer, Martin Sawyer, a corporate attorney who'd handled Hartwell Properties legal matters for years. They went into Dad's room while I was in the kitchen preparing his medication. I heard low voices discussing documents and signatures but didn't think much of it. Dad had been signing various papers throughout his illness, medical directives and business authorizations. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Martin was tucking a folder into his briefcase. Derek looked satisfied in a way that made me vaguely uneasy, but he just nodded at me and said Dad needed rest. They left quickly, and when I went to check on Dad, he was already asleep, a pen still resting on the bedside table. The final week was brutal. Dad stopped eating entirely, taking only sips of water and liquid morphine. His breathing became labored, rattling in his chest. The hospice nurse explained this was the active dying process, that it could last days or pass quickly. I held his hand constantly, telling him it was okay to let go, that I loved him despite everything. Derek came by once during that final week, staying for less than an hour. He stood at the foot of Dad's bed, clearly uncomfortable with the reality of death. "Let me know when it happens," he said as he left. "I'll handle the funeral arrangements." It struck me as odd that he assumed he'd be making those decisions, but I was too exhausted to argue about logistics. Dad died on a Thursday evening just as the sun was setting. I was alone with him, holding his hand and reading aloud from his favorite book about the history of Portland. His breathing simply stopped between one sentence and the next, so quietly that I almost didn't notice. The hospice nurse confirmed what I already knew, then helped me make the necessary calls. I called Derek first. His response was measured, almost businesslike. "I see. Okay. I'll contact the funeral home and Martin Sawyer. Don't do anything until I get there." He arrived an hour later with Claudia, who dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue while Derek immediately began making phone calls from Dad's study. The funeral home came to collect Dad's body, a surreal experience that left me feeling hollowed out. After they left, Derek emerged from the study with a list of tasks. "The funeral will be Monday at Riverview Cemetery. I've already contacted the minister. We'll have a reception afterward at the country club. Shouldn't we discuss this together?" I asked. He was my father too. "Someone needs to take charge, Jennifer. You've been handling the medical stuff. I'll handle the business and funeral arrangements." His tone left no room for argument, and I was too drained to fight. The next few days passed in a blur of condolence calls and flower deliveries. Thomas drove down from Seattle to be with me, providing quiet support while Derek orchestrated everything like a corporate event. The obituary Derek wrote barely mentioned me, focusing instead on Dad's business achievements and Derek's role as his successor. When I pointed out the omission, Derek added a single line: "He is also survived by his daughter Jennifer Hartwell Chin." The morning of the funeral arrived with typical Portland drizzle, gray skies matching the somber mood. I dressed in a black suit my mother-in-law had helped me select, Thomas adjusting my collar and squeezing my shoulders. "I'm right here with you," he murmured. "Every step." Riverview Cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the Willamette River, old growth trees providing natural shelter from the rain. The funeral home had erected a green canopy over the gravesite, chairs arranged in neat rows. As Thomas and I arrived, I was surprised by the turnout. Hundreds of people had come, business associates and employees from Hartwell Properties, members of Dad's country club, faces I recognized from my childhood and many I didn't. Derek stood near the front, accepting condolences like a receiving line, Claudia beside him in designer black and oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky. When I approached, Derek barely glanced at me. "You should sit in the second row," he said. "Family's in front." "I am family," I replied, confused. "Immediate family," he clarified. "Me, Claudia, the kids. You can sit right behind us." Before I could process the insult, Thomas's hand on my elbow guided me away. "It's not worth it," he whispered. "Not today." We took seats in the second row, and I tried to ignore the stares from people who clearly found the seating arrangement strange. The service began with the minister's generic platitudes about Richard Hartwell's life and legacy. Derek gave a eulogy that focused heavily on Dad's business acumen and his role as a mentor to Derek specifically. He mentioned me exactly once: "Dad is survived by my sister Jennifer, who cared for him in his final months." The acknowledgement felt like an afterthought. Several business associates spoke, sharing stories about Dad's negotiation tactics and real estate instincts. No one mentioned his personal life, his love for Mom, his complicated relationships with his children. It felt like a shareholder meeting rather than a goodbye to a human being. As the minister was beginning final prayers, Derek suddenly stood up. The minister paused, confused, as my brother walked to the front and turned to face the assembled crowd. My stomach dropped. Whatever was coming, I knew it wouldn't be good. "Before we conclude," Derek began, his voice carrying across the cemetery, "there's something important that needs to be addressed. My father's estate and his final wishes." He pulled papers from his jacket pocket, unfolding them with deliberate slowness. 3 weeks ago, Dad updated his will with complete clarity about his intentions for Hartwell Properties and his assets. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was highly inappropriate, discussing estate matters at a funeral, but Derek seemed energized by the attention. He looked directly at me, and I saw something cruel in his expression. "My sister has spent considerable time with Dad recently, and I'm sure she's been hoping that proximity would translate into financial benefit." His words were poison wrapped in concern. But Dad was very clear with me about his wishes. "Jennifer, you should know now, in front of everyone, that you get nothing. Dad changed his will to leave everything to me. The house, the business, all of it. You're not getting a single penny." The world seemed to tilt sideways. People turned to stare at me, some shocked, others seeming to relish the drama. Thomas's arm came around my shoulders as I struggled to process what Derek had just announced. My father, who'd apologized for his favoritism, who'd promised things were balanced, had apparently left me completely out of his will. Derek was still talking, enjoying his moment. "Dad told me he wanted to ensure Hartwell Properties stayed intact, that the business he built remained strong under unified leadership. He knew I'd been running the company for years and that Jennifer had her own successful career. She doesn't need family money." Tears of humiliation and betrayal burned my eyes. People were whispering now, the gossip spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I wanted to stand up, to scream that this couldn't be true, but my body felt paralyzed. Thomas was tense beside me, his jaw clenched with barely contained rage. Then, from the back of the assembly, a voice cut through the murmurs. "That's quite enough, Mr. Hartwell. Everyone turned to see Martin Sawyer, Dad's longtime attorney, walking up the center aisle. He looked furious, his usually composed face flushed with anger. In his hand, he carried a leather portfolio I recognized from Dad's study. "Martin," Derek said, his confidence wavering slightly. "I was just explaining Dad's wishes to the family." "You were lying," Martin said flatly, reaching the front. "And doing so at your father's funeral, which is perhaps the most despicable thing I've witnessed in 40 years of legal practice." The crowd went completely silent. Derek's face drained of color. "What are you talking about? You were there when Dad signed the new will. You witnessed it yourself." "I witnessed your father sign several documents 3 weeks ago," yes, Martin agreed. "What I didn't witness, because it never happened, was him signing a will that disinherited Jennifer." He opened the portfolio and removed a thick document. "This is your father's actual last will and testament, executed 6 months ago and never modified. Would you like me to read the relevant provisions out loud?" Derek's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Claudia grabbed his arm, looking panicked. I sat frozen, unable to process what was happening. Martin didn't wait for Derek's response. He pulled reading glasses from his pocket and began reading in a clear, authoritative voice. "I, Richard James Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. To my son Derek Hartwell, I leave my 30% ownership stake in Hartwell Properties Incorporated, which he has earned through his years of dedicated service to the company." Derek's face showed confusion mixed with relief. He still got the business, so what was the problem? Martin continued reading. "To my daughter Jennifer Hartwell Chen, I leave the following: my primary residence at 1742 Laurelhurst Drive, valued at approximately $2.3 million. My investment portfolio with Cascade Wealth Management, currently valued at approximately $8.7 million. My collection of commercial properties held personally rather than through Hartwell Properties, including the Riverside Mall, the Sunnyside Shopping Center, and the Parkview Office Complex, with a combined assessed value of approximately $32 million. Gasps erupted from the crowd. My hand flew to my mouth. Martin kept reading, his voice steady. Additionally, Jennifer shall receive the family cabin at Mount Hood, my late wife Patricia's jewelry collection, and all personal effects not otherwise specified. The remaining cash assets, approximately $3.2 million, shall be divided equally between Derek and Jennifer. The numbers were staggering. While Derek got control of Hartwell Properties, I was inheriting assets worth more than $45 million. The commercial properties alone were generating millions in annual rental income. Martin closed the document and looked directly at Derek. Your father never changed this will. The documents he signed 3 weeks ago pertain to business succession planning and medical directives. At no point did he express any intention to disinherit Jennifer. In fact, he specifically told me, multiple times, that he wanted to ensure she was well provided for as an apology for years of favoritism toward you. Derek found his voice, though it came out strangled. That's not possible. Dad told me the business was everything. He said I was his legacy. The business is not everything, Martin replied coldly. And apparently your father realized that before he died. He wanted to balance the lifetime of advantages he'd given you with substantial assets for Jennifer. He turned to me, his expression softening. Your father called me 2 weeks before his death to confirm the will was properly executed. He was worried Derek might contest it, so he had me prepare additional documentation establishing his mental competency at the time of signing. He wanted to make absolutely certain you'd receive what he'd promised. I couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down my face now, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were something more complex, a mixture of vindication, sorrow, and disbelief. Derek was sputtering, trying to recover. This is a mistake. Dad wouldn't have left her more than me. She doesn't even work in the business. The commercial properties your father left Jennifer are worth nearly as much as the entire Hartwell Properties Company, Martin said. And they're unencumbered by debt, unlike the company which carries substantial mortgages thanks to your recent acquisitions. Your father was many things, Mr. Hartwell, but he was not stupid about asset allocation. The crowd was buzzing now, people openly discussing what they'd just witnessed. Derek's humiliation was complete, his attempt to publicly disinherit me backfiring spectacularly. Claudia was tugging at his sleeve, whispering urgently that they should leave. Martin approached me, holding out the will. Jennifer, I apologize that this had to happen at the funeral. I'd planned to read the will privately at my office tomorrow, as is customary. But I couldn't let Derek's lies stand unchallenged. I took the document with shaking hands. Thank you, Martin. I had no idea Dad had done this. He wanted to surprise you, Martin said gently. He felt he'd failed you as a father, and this was his way of trying to make amends. He was actually quite proud of the plan, structuring it so the assets would provide you with financial security and independence. Thomas was reading over my shoulder, his own shock evident. This is extraordinary, he murmured. Richard really came through in the end. Derek was still standing there, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. People were openly staring at him now, whispering about his attempted deception. Finally, he turned on his heel and stalked away, Claudia hurrying after him. Their departure sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. The minister, who'd been standing awkwardly to the side during the entire exchange, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should conclude the service? He led a brief final prayer, but everyone's attention was clearly elsewhere. As soon as he finished, people began approaching me, some offering condolences, others clearly curious about what they'd just witnessed. Aunt Susan fought her way through the crowd to embrace me fiercely. Your mother would be so proud, she whispered. Not of the money, but of how you handled yourself. You've been gracious through all of this. She pulled back, her eyes fierce. And Derek deserves everything he just got. That boy has been spoiled rotten his entire life. Thomas fielded questions while I tried to compose myself. Martin stayed close, explaining to interested parties that the will was ironclad and filed with the probate court. Derek would have no grounds to contest it, especially given the witnesses and competency documentation. As the crowd finally began to disperse, I stood looking at Dad's casket, still suspended over the grave. My feelings were impossibly tangled. Grief for the father I'd lost, anger at the years of favoritism I'd endured, gratitude for this final gesture, confusion about what it all meant. He really did love you, Martin said quietly, appearing beside me. In his way. He talked about you constantly in those final months, telling me about your achievements, your strength, how much you reminded him of your mother. He knew he'd failed you, and this was the only way he knew to say he was sorry. I would have preferred he just told me, I said softly. That he'd spent less time with Derek and more time actually being my father. I know. And I think he knew that too. But Richard Hartwell spoke through his wallet better than he ever spoke through words. Martin patted my shoulder. Come to my office tomorrow afternoon. We'll go through everything in detail. There are also some personal letters he left for you. After everyone had left, Thomas and I stood alone at the gravesite as cemetery workers prepared to lower the casket. The rain had stopped, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. I placed my hand on the smooth wood, feeling the cool surface beneath my palm. I don't know if I can forgive you, I whispered to Dad. You hurt me my entire life. But thank you for this. Thank you for finally seeing me. Thomas drove us back to Dad's house, the house that was now mine. We walked through the rooms in silence, seeing everything differently now. This wasn't just the place I'd grown up or the place I'd cared for Dad in his final months. This was my property, my inheritance, my father's final statement about my value. In Dad's study, I found a framed photo I'd never noticed before, tucked in the back of his desk drawer. It showed Mom holding infant me, her face radiant with joy. On the back, in Dad's handwriting, Patricia and Jennifer, 1993. My beautiful girls. The photo had been hidden away, but he'd kept it. Had looked at it, presumably, when he was alone. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. We need to talk about this. Dad was clearly not in his right mind. I'm contesting the will. I showed Thomas, who shook his head grimly. Let him try, Thomas said. Martin made it clear there's documentation proving your dad's competency. Derek's just furious he doesn't get to control everything. Another text came through, this one from a number I didn't recognize. Jennifer, this is Claudia. Derek is very upset. Can you please consider giving him some of the properties? It's only fair since he ran the business. I stared at it in disbelief, then blocked the number. That evening, as Thomas and I sat in the living room of my inherited house, I pulled out the will and read through it carefully. Martin was right. Every detail was meticulously documented. Dad had even included a letter to the probate judge explaining his reasoning, stating explicitly that he'd favored Derek throughout their lives and wanted to balance the scales. There was a separate sealed envelope addressed to me in Dad's handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers and unfolded several pages of his distinctive script. My dearest Jennifer, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've learned about the provisions I've made for you. I suspect Derek reacted poorly. He's used to being the center of attention, and I bear full responsibility for that. I hope Martin was able to prevent him from causing too much trouble at the funeral, though knowing your brother, he probably tried something dramatic. I smiled sadly. Dad had known Derek would pull a stunt. The letter continued, I've spent your entire life treating you as less important than your brother, and I have no excuse that makes it acceptable. You reminded me so much of your mother that I couldn't look at you without feeling the pain of her loss. Instead of cherishing that connection, I pushed you away. Meanwhile, I poured all my attention into Derek because he was easier, because he never challenged me, because I could mold him into a version of myself. What I failed to see until far too late was that you didn't need molding. You were already extraordinary. You built a successful career without my help. You earned respect in your industry on your own merit. You found a good man who loves you properly. And when I was dying, you came back and cared for me with a grace I never deserved. These assets I'm leaving you aren't enough to make up for 32 years of emotional neglect. Nothing could be. But they represent my attempt to acknowledge your worth, to provide for your future, and to say in the only language I truly speak that you mattered. You always mattered. I'm sorry I never showed you that when I was alive. The properties I've left you are the best performing assets I own. They'll generate substantial income and continue to appreciate. I've structured everything so Derek can't interfere with your inheritance. You owe him nothing, Jennifer. You owe me nothing either. But I hope you'll use these resources to build the life you deserve. I love you. I should have said it more often. I should have shown it consistently. I failed as your father in most ways that mattered. But please know that in my final months, getting to actually know you was the greatest gift. You made dying less frightening. You gave me glimpses of the relationship we could have had if I'd been brave enough to face my grief decades ago. Be happy, my daughter. Live fully. And forgive me if you can, though I understand if you can't. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. I'm proud too, even if I never adequately expressed it. The letter was signed simply, Dad, with a shaky signature that showed how weak he'd been when writing it. I cried then, really cried for the first time since his death. Not polite tears at a funeral but deep, wrenching sobs for everything we'd lost, for the relationship we'd never had, for the father he'd never quite managed to be. Thomas held me through it, not trying to fix anything, just being present. When the tears finally subsided, I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd carried for so long didn't disappear, but it began to transform into something else. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Dad had been broken by Mom's death, and he'd handled it in the worst possible way. He'd damaged both his children, though in different ways. And in the end, he tried to make it right the only way he knew how. The next afternoon, Thomas and I met with Martin Sawyer at his downtown office. He walked us through every aspect of the estate in meticulous detail. The commercial properties were indeed generating substantial rental income, over $2 million annually after expenses. The investment portfolio was well diversified, positioned for long-term growth. The house was paid off, as was the mountain cabin. Your father was quite clever about this, Martin explained. He knew Derek would have Hartwell properties, which sounds impressive but is actually leveraged with substantial debt from recent acquisitions. The properties he left you are unencumbered and cash flowing. In purely financial terms, you received the better inheritance. Will Derek be able to contest successfully? I asked. Martin shook his head firmly. I've been practicing estate law for 4 decades. This will is bulletproof. Your father specifically had me document his mental state, his reasoning, and his intentions. We have video testimony from 2 weeks before his death where he explicitly states his wishes. Derek can file a contest, but he'll lose and likely incur significant legal fees in the process. True to form, Derek did file a contest within a week. His lawyers argued that Dad had been unduly influenced by my presence during his final months, that he wasn't competent to make major estate decisions while on morphine, that the assets should be divided equally. Martin demolished each argument with documentation, medical records proving Dad's lucidity when signing the will, and testimony from the hospice nurses about his mental state. The probate judge, after reviewing everything, not only upheld the will but publicly admonished Derek's attorneys for bringing a frivolous challenge. The ruling stated explicitly that Richard Hartwell had been demonstrably competent and clear in his intentions to provide for his daughter Jennifer in a manner that acknowledged years of favoritism toward his son Derek. Derek's attempt to contest cost him over $80,000 in legal fees and further damaged his reputation. Stories began circulating in Portland's business community about his behavior at the funeral and his failed legal challenge. Several longtime Hartwell Properties clients quietly moved their business elsewhere, uncomfortable with Derek's character. Meanwhile, I worked with Thomas and a team of advisors to manage my new assets. The commercial properties needed some updating, and I threw myself into the work, using my architecture background to design renovations that would increase both property values and rental income. It felt meaningful to improve what Dad had built, to put my own stamp on his legacy. The Riverside Mall, one of the properties I'd inherited, had been struggling with vacancies. I developed a comprehensive plan to reposition it as a mixed-use development, adding apartments and office space while updating the retail. When I presented the proposal to tenants and the City Planning Commission, I felt Dad's presence, imagining what he might have thought of my approach. 6 months after Dad's death, I stood at the Riverside property with construction crews beginning the renovation. Thomas was beside me, reviewing structural plans, when my phone rang with Aunt Susan's number. "Jennifer, honey, I thought you should know. Derek and Claudia are getting divorced. Apparently the financial stress from his legal fees and some bad business decisions has been too much. Word is she's leaving him for one of his former business partners." I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Satisfaction that Derek was facing consequences, but also a twinge of sympathy for the nephew and niece I barely knew who would suffer through their parents' divorce. "How's he handling it?" I asked. "Not well, from what I hear. He's been drinking heavily, and there are rumors about financial problems at Hartwell Properties. Some of those acquisitions he made are underwater, and without your dad there to bail him out." She trailed off meaningfully. Part of me wanted to gloat, to see Derek's downfall as karmic justice. But I thought about Dad's letter, about how both Derek and I had been damaged by his parenting, just in different ways. Derek had been given everything and learned to expect it. Now reality was teaching him harsh lessons. "Let me know if he actually needs help," I told Aunt Susan. "Not money, but if there's something real. He's still my brother." She was quiet for a moment. "You're a better person than I am, sweetheart. After what he did at the funeral." "I'm not doing it for him," I admitted. "I'm doing it because I don't want to become bitter. Dad gave me this incredible gift. The least I can do is not poison it with resentment." A year after Dad's death, Thomas and I hosted a small dedication ceremony at the newly renovated Riverside development. We'd renamed it Patricia's Plaza after my mother, with Dad's blessing from beyond the grave, mentioned in one of his letters. The renovation was stunning, blending the original 50s architecture with modern updates, creating a vibrant community space. Aunt Susan came, along with several of Dad's former business associates who'd been impressed by my work. To my surprise, Derek appeared as well, looking thinner and tired but sober. We hadn't spoken since the probate hearing. He approached me cautiously after the dedication. Jennifer, can we talk? We walked to a quiet corner of the plaza, away from other guests. Derek stared at the ground, struggling with words. I've been in therapy. Court-ordered after a DUI, but it's actually been helpful. My therapist thinks I have narcissistic tendencies, probably from how Dad raised me. Probably, I agreed neutrally. I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies, actually. For the funeral. For the will contest. For my entire life, really. I treated you like you didn't matter because Dad did, and I never questioned it. He finally met my eyes. You deserved better. From him and from me. The apology hung between us, and I considered my response carefully. Derek looked genuinely broken, his arrogance stripped away by circumstances he'd never imagined facing. The brother who'd always had everything handed to him had finally encountered consequences he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. It doesn't erase 32 years of being invisible in my own family, but I appreciate it. I know. And I'm not asking for forgiveness or trying to get anything from you. I just needed to say it. He glanced around the plaza, taking in the renovations. This is really impressive, what you've done here. Dad would have been proud. Maybe. Or maybe he would have criticized my design choices and suggested Derek could have done it better. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. Derek winced. Yeah. Probably. That was our dynamic, wasn't it? He built me up by tearing you down, and I just accepted it as normal. He shoved his hands in his pockets. Therapy's been eye-opening. Turns out being the favorite wasn't actually good for me either. I never learned to handle failure or criticism because Dad protected me from both. Now I'm 37, divorced, and my company's barely staying afloat because I made reckless decisions assuming Dad would always fix my mistakes. What are you going to do? I asked, curious despite myself. Figure it out on my own for once. I've got a business consultant helping me restructure. It's going to mean selling off some properties, downsizing, actually running things responsibly instead of just making flashy acquisitions. He paused. I won't ask you for money or help. You don't owe me anything. But maybe someday we could try to have an actual sibling relationship. Not now, I know I haven't earned that. But eventually? I thought about Dad's letter, about how he damaged both of us in different ways. Derek had been enabled into incompetence and entitlement while I'd been neglected into self-reliance and achievement. Neither was healthy, just different forms of parental failure. Maybe eventually, I said. But you need to do the work on yourself first. Real work, not just therapy because a judge ordered it. I know. I am. It's harder than anything I've ever done. He looked at me with something that might have been respect. You turned out okay despite everything. I'm trying to figure out how to do the same. After Derek left, Thomas found me still standing in that quiet corner. How did that go? Strange. He apologized. Actually seemed to mean it. I leaned against Thomas, grateful for his steady presence. I don't know if we'll ever have a real relationship, but at least he's finally taking responsibility. That's more than most people get from their siblings, Thomas observed. How are you feeling about all of it? Honestly? I feel free. For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for Dad's approval or competing for his attention. I'm not making myself smaller so Derek can feel bigger. I'm just living my life on my terms. I gestured at the plaza. And building things I'm proud of with resources Dad gave me as his final apology. We stood together watching people move through Patricia's plaza, families and couples enjoying the space I'd created. A little girl ran past chasing bubbles, her laughter echoing off the renovated buildings. It struck me that this was Dad's legacy too, not just the profits and properties but the community spaces that would serve people for generations. 3 months later, I discovered I was pregnant. Thomas and I had been trying for a while, but the timing felt significant. New life emerging from all this death and transformation. When I told Aunt Susan, she cried and said Mom would have been overjoyed. I didn't tell Derek immediately, unsure how he'd react given his own family struggles. But when I was 5 months along, showing clearly, I ran into him at a charity event for Portland's homeless youth. He looked better, healthier, more grounded than I'd seen him in years. "Congratulations," he said, nodding at my belly. "Boy or girl?" "Girl. We're naming her Patricia, after Mom." Something flickered across his face, emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Mom would have loved that. She always wanted a granddaughter." He paused. "I barely remember her, you know. I was so young when she died." "You look like her though. Dad used to say that." He told me that too, finally. In one of his letters. I studied Derek's face, seeing traces of Dad in his features while I carried Mom's. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if she'd lived?" "All the time. Maybe Dad wouldn't have been so broken. Maybe he would have treated us both fairly instead of playing favorites." Derek shrugged. "Or maybe he would have been the same. Some people just have a golden child regardless." "Maybe. But we'll never know." I placed a hand on my belly, feeling Patricia kick. "I'm trying to learn from their mistakes. To be present for this baby, to love her unconditionally, to not make her compete for affection." "You'll be a great mom," Derek said, and it sounded genuine. "You've got more emotional intelligence than our entire family combined." We parted cordially, not quite friends but no longer enemies. It felt like progress, however small. Patricia Rose Chen was born on a sunny morning in May, healthy and perfect with Thomas's dark eyes and my mother's delicate features. Holding her in the hospital, I felt the weight of generational pain begin to lift. This baby would know she was loved, would never doubt her worth, would grow up understanding that family means showing up. Aunt Susan was the first visitor, arriving with flowers and tears of joy. "She's absolutely beautiful, Jennifer. Your parents would be so proud." "One of them would be," I corrected gently. "Mom definitely would." "Dad, I think he finally got there at the end." 2 weeks after Patricia's birth, Derek sent a gift. Not something expensive or showy, but a carefully chosen antique picture frame with a note, "For baby Patricia's first photo. Welcome to the family. I'm working on being the uncle she deserves." Inside the package was also a small envelope containing a check for $10,000 made out to the SIDS Research Foundation Thomas and I had established in Emma's name, though Derek had no way of knowing about Emma since he'd never asked about my life. I stared at the check, confused, then called him. "Derek, this is incredibly generous, but we never talked about SIDS research." "Why this charity?" There was a long pause. "I Googled you a few months ago." "Really Googled you, reading about your work and your life. I saw the foundation and realized I never even asked if you'd had other children before Patricia. I'm guessing there's a story there." So I told him about Emma, about losing her to SIDS years before Dad got sick, about the grief that still surfaced at unexpected moments. Derek listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Jennifer. That you went through that alone, that I was so self-absorbed I never even knew. Emma deserved better from her uncle." "She deserved to be known by her uncle," I agreed. "But you're trying now. That matters." We talked for over an hour, the longest conversation we'd ever had that wasn't about business or family drama. He told me about his therapy, about recognizing patterns of entitlement and working to change them. About his kids and co-parenting with Claudia, about running Hartwell properties more responsibly. About attempting to become someone he could respect. After we hung up, I looked at baby Patricia sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. She would grow up knowing both her cousins, Aiden and Brooke. She'd have an uncle who was learning to be better. She'd hear stories about the grandfather who'd failed but ultimately tried to make amends, and about the grandmother who'd died too young but loved deeply. Standing in Patricia's nursery, surrounded by the pale yellow walls and handmade quilts, I thought about the journey from that rainy funeral where Derek had tried to publicly humiliate me. How Martin Sawyer's intervention had changed everything, revealing Dad's true intentions and Derek's deception. How the inheritance had been both a financial blessing and an emotional reckoning. Dad's money had given me security and options, but his letters had given me something more valuable, confirmation that I'd been worthy all along. The neglect had been about his brokenness, not my inadequacy. That understanding had freed me in ways no amount of wealth could. I'd taken his commercial properties and improved them, putting my architectural training to use in ways that honored both his business acumen and Mom's creative spirit. Patricia's Plaza was just the beginning. I had plans for the other properties, visions of community spaces that would serve Portland for decades. Derek was rebuilding his life with humility he'd never possessed before, learning lessons that perhaps needed to come through loss and failure. We'd never have the sibling relationship stolen by years of favoritism, but we were constructing something new, built on honesty rather than competition. Thomas appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene of me watching our daughter sleep. "Everything okay?" "Everything's good," I said truthfully. Derek called. "We actually talked, really talked." "He's trying." "People can change," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Look at how far you've come. From the woman who felt invisible at her own father's funeral to this. A successful architect, a mother, someone who turned inheritance into legacy." He was right. The woman standing at that graveside a year ago, humiliated and heartbroken, had transformed into someone stronger. Someone who knew her worth regardless of external validation. Someone building a future rather than dwelling in past hurts. Baby Patricia stirred, making small noises that meant she'd wake soon and want a nurse. I lifted her gently, breathing in her sweet baby scent, feeling her tiny hand grasp my finger with surprising strength. "Your grandfather left me a lot of things," I whispered to her. "Money and properties and a letter explaining why he'd failed as a father. But the best thing he left me was the determination to do better. You'll always know you're loved, sweet girl. You'll never have to earn affection or compete for attention. That's my promise to you." Thomas kissed the top of my head, and we stood together in the peaceful nursery, our small family complete. Outside the window, Portland stretched toward distant mountains, the city where 3 generations of Hartwells had built their lives in different ways. Dad's empire would continue through Derek's management of Hartwell properties, evolving as my brother learned to lead with integrity rather than entitlement. Mom's memory lived on through Patricia's name and the plaza that bore hers. And I was creating my own legacy, one of intentional presence and unconditional love. The inheritance had been substantial, but the real gift was freedom from seeking approval I'd never received. In Dad's final gesture, he'd released me from 32 years of feeling less than. The money was wonderful, but that liberation was priceless. As Patricia nursed contentedly, her dark eyes fixed on my face with the intensity of newborns, I felt the last threads of resentment finally dissolve. Dad had been flawed and hurtful, but he'd also been human and ultimately remorseful. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing, but it did mean choosing peace over perpetual anger. "Thank you, Dad," I murmured, knowing he couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. For the money, for the apology, for finally seeing me. It came late, but it came. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.